When my wife, Clara, and I first bought our home on Maple Lane, we thought we'd found paradise. The street was lined with tall oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze, and the houses all had this cozy charm to them. It felt like the kind of place where kids could ride bikes safely, neighbors would wave hello, and life would move at a slower, more peaceful pace. We were excited. This was supposed to be our fresh start, our forever home. But what we didn't realize was that behind the picture-perfect facade of Maple Lane lurked something darker, something controlling. And its name was Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the head of the Homeowners Association, or HOA, as everyone called it. From the moment we moved in, she made sure we knew who was in charge. On our very first day, there she was, standing on our doorstep with a clipboard tucked under her arm and an overly bright smile plastered across her face. She welcomed us warmly enough. At least, it sounded warm until she handed me a thick binder labeled *HOA Guidelines*. "Welcome to Maple Lane," she said cheerfully, adjusting her sunglasses even though we were inside. "This little book has everything you need to know about living here. Don't worry. It's pretty easy once you get the hang of it." Easy? If only she knew how wrong she was. The binder was packed full of rules. So many rules that I couldn't believe anyone actually followed them all. There were regulations about lawn length, no longer than 2 inches, mailbox colors, only shades approved by the HOA committee, and even restrictions on what kind of curtains we could hang in our windows. Who thinks about curtain colors when they buy a house? Apparently, Karen did. At first, I laughed it off. Sure, the rules seemed ridiculous, but how much harm could they really do? I figured people probably ignored half of them anyway. After all, no one cared if your mailbox was slightly crooked or if your grass grew an inch too long, right? Wrong. It didn't take long for me to learn just how serious Karen was about enforcing these so-called guidelines. A few weeks after moving in, I decided to add some character to our yard. Nothing crazy. I bought a set of small solar-powered garden lights to line the driveway. They weren't flashy or obnoxious, just simple little lights that glowed softly at night. I thought they looked nice. Clara loved them. So imagine my surprise when, 2 days later, I found an envelope taped to our front door. Inside was a formal notice from Karen herself. It read, "Dear Mr. Hayes, your decorative lighting violates Section 7.3 of the HOA Guidelines regarding approved exterior fixtures. Please remove them within 5 days or incur a fine of $50 per day." I stared at the letter, dumbfounded. $50 a day for lights. Lights that barely lit up anything. This had to be a joke. But when I called Karen to ask about it, her tone left no room for humor. "The rules are very clear," she said matter-of-factly. "If you want to live here, you'll need to follow them." Reluctantly, I took down the lights. I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over. Not yet, anyway. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Little did I know, Karen wasn't done with us. Not by a long shot. After the garden light incident, I tried to lay low. I figured if I kept my head down and avoided drawing attention to myself, Karen might leave us alone. But as it turned out, staying under her radar was easier said than done. It seemed like no matter what I did or didn't do, there was always something else that caught her eye. One Saturday morning, Clara and I decided to repaint our mailbox. The old one was looking a little worn, so we picked a neutral shade of gray from the hardware store. Nothing flashy. Nothing bold, just a nice, safe color that blended in with the rest of the neighborhood. We spent hours sanding, priming, and painting, making sure it looked perfect. When we were done, we stood back and admired our work. "It looks great," Clara said with a satisfied smile. And for a moment, I actually felt proud of it. But pride, as they say, comes before a fall. The next day, another envelope appeared on our doorstep. This time, the letter inside wasn't about lights. It was about our shiny new mailbox. According to Karen, The shade of gray we'd chosen was not approved by the HOA's designated color palette. Apparently, there was a specific swatch card residents were supposed to use when selecting paint colors. Who even knew such a thing existed? Certainly not me. And the penalty. Another fine. This time $100 per week, until the mailbox was repainted in an approved hue. I couldn't believe it. $100 a week for a mailbox. It felt like something out of a bad sitcom. Except this was real life, and it was happening to us. By now, frustration was starting to bubble over. Every interaction with Karen left me feeling smaller, like I was being backed into a corner with no way out. I tried reasoning with her, explaining that the color difference was barely noticeable and asking if there was any room for compromise. Her response was curt and final. "Rules are rules, Mr. Hayes." Things only got worse from there. A few weeks later, Clara bought a set of wind chimes as a gift for our anniversary. They were beautiful, handcrafted, delicate, and musical in a way that made the backyard feel peaceful. For the first time in days, I felt like we'd done something right. Until, of course, Karen showed up at our door. "I've received multiple complaints about noise pollution," she announced, gesturing vaguely toward the wind chimes hanging from our porch. Noise pollution. From wind chimes? I almost laughed, but the look on her face told me she was dead serious. She handed me yet another notice. $75 per day until the chimes were removed. At this point, I was beyond angry. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was the principle. Why should someone like Karen have so much control over our lives? Who gave her the authority to dictate every tiny detail of how we lived? I started losing sleep over it, lying awake at night replaying conversations with her in my head and wondering where it would all end. Clara begged me to let it go. "Just pay the fines and move on," she pleaded one evening. "It's not worth the stress." But deep down, I knew she was as fed up as I was. The fines were piling up faster than we could keep track of them, and each new letter felt like another brick in the wall Karen was building around us. What scared me most was the realization that we weren't the only ones suffering. As I talked to other neighbors, I discovered that many of them had similar stories. Fines for minor infractions, threats of legal action, constant scrutiny over things that shouldn't have mattered. Some had simply given up and moved away, while others chose to stay silent, too afraid to speak out. Karen's grip on Maple Lane wasn't just annoying, it was suffocating. And as much as I wanted to ignore her and hope she'd eventually lose interest, I couldn't shake the growing sense that something needed to change. If nobody else was willing to stand up to her, then maybe it was up to me. But standing up to Karen wouldn't be easy, not when she held all the cards. Little did I know, the battle was only beginning. As the weeks turned into months, Karen's fines kept coming, relentless and unyielding. Each new letter felt like a punch to the gut, draining not just our bank account, but also our patience. What started as small annoyances had spiraled into something far more serious. It wasn't just about the mailbox or the wind chimes anymore. It was about control. Karen wanted to make it clear that she was in charge, and we were nothing more than tenants living under her thumb. One evening, after receiving yet another notice for some trivial violation, I couldn't even remember what it was this time. I sat at the kitchen table with Clara, staring at the stack of papers in front of me. The total amount I owed the HOA had climbed to nearly $50,000. $50,000. For things like improperly aligned blinds and unapproved driveway cracks. It was absurd, laughable even, if it weren't so devastating. Clara looked at me with tired eyes. "We can't keep going like this," she said softly. "It's eating you alive." She was right. Every day felt heavier than the last. I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations with Karen in my head, imagining ways I could have stood up to her or called her out on her nonsense. But no matter how many scenarios I ran through, one thing was certain. Arguing with Karen directly wasn't working. She always had an answer, always had another rule to throw at me. And the fines, they just kept piling up. But somewhere in the back of my mind, An idea began to form. Maybe fighting Karen on her terms wasn't the solution. Maybe I needed to change the game entirely. The next morning, instead of focusing on the latest fine, I decided to dig deeper. I hired a private investigator, not because I thought Karen was hiding something illegal, at least not yet, but because I wanted to understand the power structure of Maple Lane. Who owned the houses? Who sat on the HOA board? How did decisions really get made? What I discovered shocked me. It turned out that several homes on Maple Lane weren't owner-occupied. Some belonged to absentee landlords who rented them out, while others were owned by elderly residents looking to sell but holding onto their properties for tax reasons. Even more surprising, Karen herself didn't own her house outright. It was part of a trust controlled by her late husband's estate. In short, much of the neighborhood was ripe for change if someone with resources stepped in. That's when the gears in my head started turning. If Karen's power came from her position as HOA president, and if that position relied on controlling property votes, what would happen if I took that control away from her? I'll admit, the idea sounded crazy at first. Buying multiple houses on a single street wasn't exactly something people did every day. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If I could acquire enough properties, I'd gain influence over the HOA. Suddenly, Karen wouldn't be calling the shots anymore. I would. Of course, this wasn't going to be easy. Real estate transactions take time, money, and strategy. I knew I'd have to act quickly and discreetly. If word got out that I was buying up homes, Karen might catch on and try to block me. So I worked behind the scenes, quietly negotiating deals with sellers and lining up financing. Within weeks, I'd purchased 3 houses on Maple Lane. Then 4, then 5. Each purchase gave me a little more leverage, a little more confidence. By the time I bought my 7th house, including Karen's own residence, I knew I had her beat. Not only did I now control a majority stake in the HOA, but I also held the keys to the very home Karen lived in. Talk about poetic justice. Still, I wasn't ready to reveal my hand just yet. There was one final move to make, a grand gesture that would topple Karen's reign once and for all. And when the moment came, I wanted it to be unforgettable. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Karen had underestimated me, written me off as just another homeowner she could bully into submission. But she'd forgotten one crucial detail. I wasn't just any homeowner. I was someone who refused to back down without a fight. And now, thanks to careful planning and a healthy dose of determination, I was ready to strike back. The day I decided to reveal my plan, I could barely contain my excitement. For months, Karen had treated me like a powerless nobody, someone she could push around with her endless rules and fines. But now, the tables were about to turn, and in a way she'd never see coming. I called an emergency meeting of the HOA, citing urgent business that required immediate attention. Part of me wondered if Karen would suspect something, but her arrogance worked in my favor. She probably assumed I was going to beg for leniency or plead my case again. If only she knew what was waiting for her. On the evening of the meeting, the community center buzzed with nervous energy. Neighbors filed in one by one, whispering among themselves. Word had spread that something big was happening, though no one seemed to know exactly what. Karen strutted in last, clipboard in hand, looking every bit the queen of Maple Lane. She took her usual seat at the head of the table, flashing her signature smug smile as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. When everyone was settled, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. All eyes turned to me, some curious, others wary. Karen tilted her head slightly, studying me with thinly veiled annoyance. "Let's get this over with," she said, tapping her pen against the table. "What is it this time, Mr. Hayes?" Her condescending tone only fueled my determination. I cleared my throat and began. "Good evening, everyone," I started, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Many of you know that I've had disagreements with the current leadership of our HOA. I glanced briefly at Karen, who rolled her eyes dramatically. Ignoring her, I continued. Over the past few months, I've been fined repeatedly for things most of us would consider minor or even irrelevant. Things like mailbox colors, wind chimes, and driveway cracks. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors nodded knowingly. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but didn't interrupt. I'm not here to complain, I went on. Instead, I've taken steps to address these issues directly and permanently. I paused, letting the tension build before delivering the knockout blow. Effective immediately, I own a majority stake in this neighborhood. 7 homes on Maple Lane, including this very building, are now under my control. The room erupted into chaos. Gasps filled the air as neighbors turned to each other in disbelief. Karen's face turned beet red, her jaw dropping open. She looked like she'd just been slapped. To clarify, I added, raising my voice to be heard over the commotion, this means I hold voting power over the HOA. Starting today, the existing board is dissolved, and all outstanding fines, including mine, will be waived. Future decisions will require unanimous consent from homeowners, ensuring fairness and transparency moving forward. Karen shot out of her seat, sputtering indignantly. This is outrageous. You can't do this. Oh, but I can. I replied calmly, pulling out a stack of property deeds. Everything is perfectly legal. Feel free to check with your lawyer. She stormed toward me, pointing a finger accusingly. You think this changes anything? You're still just a troublemaker trying to ruin our community. Her words might have stung once, but not anymore. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. No, Karen. What ruined this community was your obsession with control. Your constant need to micromanage people's lives made this place miserable. But that ends now. With that, I stepped back and let the weight of my announcement sink in. Neighbors clapped and cheered, some even standing to applaud. Others approached me afterward, thanking me for standing up to Karen and finally putting an end to her reign of terror. As for Karen, she left the meeting in a huff, slamming the door behind her. It was clear she wasn't used to losing. But then again, neither was I. And while I knew this victory wouldn't magically fix everything overnight, it was a start. A fresh beginning for Maple Lane. And for me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The battle wasn't entirely over, but I'd won the war. And honestly, it felt incredible. The days following the HOA meeting were a whirlwind of emotions, relief, triumph, and even a little disbelief. Karen had always been untouchable, ruling Maple Lane with an iron fist and making life miserable for anyone who dared to cross her. But now, for the first time in years, she was powerless. Her clipboard-wielding reign was over. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about what had happened. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact or whispered behind closed doors suddenly felt free to speak their minds. Some stopped me on the street to thank me, while others invited Clara and me over for coffee just to chat. It was like a weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders, including mine. Karen, however, wasn't taking her defeat quietly. She tried to fight back, filing appeals and threatening lawsuits, but none of it stuck. The legal documents I'd gathered during my property buying spree left no room for loopholes. Every move I'd made was above board, and Karen knew it. Still, she refused to admit defeat, storming around the neighborhood and muttering under her breath whenever she saw me. One afternoon, as I was walking our dog Max, I spotted her loading boxes into her car. At first, I thought she was moving out permanently, but when I got closer, I realized she was only packing up some personal belongings. Apparently, she decided to rent a condo downtown rather than stay in the house she technically didn't own anymore. As much as I wanted to gloat, seeing her struggle gave me no joy. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. With Karen out of the picture, the real work began. The old HOA board had been dissolved, but that didn't mean we could run the neighborhood without structure. Clara suggested holding a series of informal meetings to discuss how residents wanted things to change. Let's give people a chance to have a say, she said. That's what this whole thing was about, right? She was absolutely right. So, over the next few weeks, we hosted several gatherings in the community center. Neighbors came together to share ideas, voice concerns, and brainstorm ways to make Maple Lane feel more like a home and less like a dictatorship. Slowly but surely, trust started to rebuild. We revamped the HOA guidelines, tossing out the ridiculous rules and replacing them with common-sense policies. Grass length, no longer regulated unless it became a safety hazard. Mailbox colors, up to each homeowner's preference. Wind chimes, allowed, as long as they weren't deafening. We also created a new system for resolving disputes, ensuring that decisions would be made democratically instead of by one person's whim. Perhaps the biggest change was the shift in attitude. People began talking to each other again. Not just polite hellos, but genuine conversations. Kids played outside until sunset, and block parties became a regular occurrence. For the first time since we'd moved in, Maple Lane felt alive. As for Karen, rumors circulated that she'd joined another HOA in her new building, but her tyrannical tactics didn't go over well there either. According to online reviews, residents quickly banded together to oust her from any leadership role. Karma, it seemed, had a sense of humor. Looking back, I realized how much this experience had changed me. Before Maple Lane, I might have backed down, written off the fines as a cost of living, and kept my head down. But standing up to Karen taught me something important. Sometimes, fighting for fairness isn't just about winning. It's about creating a better future for everyone involved. And speaking of futures, Clara and I finally got to enjoy ours. Those solar-powered garden lights. They're back, lining driveways all over the street, including ours. Because sometimes, victory is best celebrated with a little light. Life on Maple Lane after Karen's downfall was like stepping into a completely different world. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Gone were the days of tense silences and wary glances between neighbors. In their place came warmth, laughter, and a renewed sense of community that none of us had realized we'd been missing. One of the first things we did as a neighborhood was organize a welcome back block party. It wasn't anything fancy, just some folding chairs, a potluck spread, and a playlist of oldies playing from someone's Bluetooth speaker. But it didn't need to be elaborate. What mattered most was the spirit behind it, reconnecting with each other and celebrating our newfound freedom from Karen's iron grip. I'll never forget the moment when Clara and I carried out a tray of homemade brownies to share. Neighbors greeted us with smiles, thanking us not just for the dessert, but for everything we'd done. "You saved us," one elderly woman said, her eyes glistening with tears. "We were all afraid to speak up, but you gave us our voices back." Her words hit me hard. Until then, I hadn't fully grasped how much fear Karen had instilled in everyone. People weren't just annoyed by her rules. They were scared of her, scared to make waves, scared to challenge her authority, scared to even think about standing up for themselves. Knowing that my actions had helped break that cycle filled me with a quiet pride I hadn't expected. But rebuilding trust took time. While most residents embraced the changes enthusiastically, a few remained cautious. Some worried that without strict oversight, the neighborhood might fall into disrepair. Others fretted about what would happen if someone else like Karen tried to seize control again. To address these concerns, we formed a rotating committee system where leadership roles changed every 6 months. This ensured no single person could dominate decision-making, and it gave everyone a chance to contribute. Clara played a huge role in this process. She had a knack for bringing people together, whether it was organizing volunteer cleanups or setting up a shared calendar for neighborhood events. Under her guidance, Maple Lane became more than just a collection of houses. It became a true community. Kids built lemonade stands at the end of driveways. Families hosted movie nights in backyards, and holiday decorations went up with cheerful abandon. No one worried anymore about getting fined for using the wrong shade of lights. Even Karen's old house found new life. After she officially moved out, I rented it to a young couple who were thrilled to join our tight-knit neighborhood. They fit right in, often joining us for weekend barbecues and game nights. Watching them settle in made me realize how far we'd come. Where once there had been division and resentment, there was now unity and joy. Of course, there were still challenges. Not every issue resolved itself overnight, and disagreements occasionally arose. But instead of turning into power struggles, they became opportunities for open dialogue. We learned to listen to each other, compromise, and find solutions that work for everyone. Slowly but surely, Maple Lane became a model for what a neighborhood could and should be. For Clara and me, the experience brought unexpected rewards. We'd always dreamed of finding a place where we could put down roots, but we never imagined it would take a battle with an overbearing HOA president to make that dream come true. Through it all, we discovered something profound. Home isn't just about walls and roofs. It's about the people who share your space, the connections you build, and the memories you create together. And speaking of memories, one of my favorites happened late one summer evening. As Clara and I sat on our porch watching the sunset, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees, I noticed something glowing softly along the street. Those solar-powered garden lights, the ones Karen had banned so many times, were shining brighter than ever. They stretched down the entire lane, casting a warm, golden light over Maple Lane. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of peace. Yes, the road to get here had been rocky. And yes, there had been moments when I doubted myself. But looking around at the vibrant, thriving neighborhood we'd helped create, I knew it had all been worth it. Because sometimes fighting for what's right doesn't just change your life. It changes the lives of everyone around you. And that, I realized, is the greatest victory of all. As the months passed, Maple Lane settled into a rhythm that felt natural and joyful. The changes we'd implemented weren't just cosmetic. They had breathed new life into the neighborhood. People laughed more, shared more, and cared for one another in ways they hadn't before. It was as if the oppressive shadow Karen had cast over us had finally lifted, allowing the sun to shine through. One of my favorite developments was how much closer Clara and I grew to our neighbors. Before, it felt like everyone lived behind invisible walls, afraid to cross boundaries or step out of line. Now those barriers were gone. We started hosting regular Front Porch Fridays, where families would gather with snacks and drinks to chat about everything from weekend plans to gardening tips. Kids raced around playing tag while adults swapped stories and advice. For the first time, Maple Lane truly felt like home, not just for us, but for everyone. Even practical improvements began to take shape, with the HOA's focus shifting from nitpicking trivialities to fostering goodwill. Residents pooled resources to tackle projects that benefited everyone. A group of volunteers repainted the playground equipment at the park down the street. Another team organized a fundraiser to install better lighting along the sidewalks. And when winter rolled around, no one complained about shoveling snow anymore. It became a community effort, with hot cocoa waiting at the end of the day. Karen's absence loomed large, though not in the way you might expect. At first, her name came up often in conversations, usually with a mix of disbelief and relief. Can you believe she actually thought she could control us like that? Someone would say, shaking their head. Over time, though, mentions of her faded. It wasn't because we forgot her. It was because we didn't need to talk about her anymore. She was no longer part of our story. Still, rumors occasionally drifted back to us about her. Apparently, she tried to insert herself into the management of her new condo association, only to be met with fierce resistance. One neighbor even joked, maybe we should send her a thank you note for proving she can't win everywhere. While I didn't wish her ill, I couldn't deny the irony of her repeated failures. Karma, as they say, has a way of balancing things out. For Clara and me, this entire journey had been transformative. We'd moved to Maple Lane hoping for a quiet, peaceful life. But instead, we'd found purpose, standing up to Karen, and ultimately dismantling her stranglehold on the neighborhood. Taught me something invaluable. Sometimes, courage isn't about grand gestures or dramatic showdowns. Sometimes, it's about refusing to stay silent when something feels wrong and finding creative ways to make it right. Clara summed it up perfectly one evening as we sat together on the porch. "You know," she said, sipping her tea, "I think we needed this. Not just for the neighborhood, but for us too." She was right. This experience had pushed me out of my comfort zone, forcing me to confront fears I didn't even realize I had. It taught me that standing up for yourself and others isn't always easy, but it's almost always worth it. More than that, it reminded me of the power of community. When people come together with a shared goal, there's nothing they can't achieve. And then there were the little victories, the ones that seemed small at first, but grew more meaningful over time. Like the solar-powered garden lights. After all the fuss Karen had made about them, seeing them lining driveways throughout the neighborhood felt like a sweet kind of justice. They weren't just decorative anymore. They symbolized resilience, unity, and the triumph of common sense over control. On clear nights, I'd walk Max down the street, taking in the soft glow of those lights and listening to the hum of conversation drifting from open windows. Neighbors waved as I passed, calling out greetings or inviting me over for coffee. Each moment felt like proof that we'd done something remarkable, not just for ourselves, but for future generations who would call Maple Lane home. Looking back, I realized that this chapter of our lives wasn't just about defeating Karen. It was about rediscovering what really matters: kindness, connection, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Maple Lane wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was ours. And that, I decided, was enough. So here's to second chances, fresh starts, and the power of light, even if it comes from a string of humble garden bowls. Because sometimes the smallest sparks ignite the biggest changes. And for that, I'll always be grateful.